Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to address this very distinguished audience. And you may ask the curious question, why on earth a bloody financial economist would love to talk about nationalism and political issues. But even try to explain to that, I'm a member of the European Parliament and I have established a new party in Hungary as well. Because now what we have in place in Hungary is a strongly authoritarian and autocratic regime, and for everybody who has the right mind needs to do something about this important phenomenon, which is a regression, a decline, and a degeneration in terms of European civilization. Lenin said actually, one step forward, two steps back. So, šаг vперед, dva šaga nazad, for those who speak Russian. So that would have been a much better title for this session, at least when it comes to Hungary. And I will talk about Hungary only because I want to leave it to the others to comment on the European perspectives. The history of Hungary after the political changes from 1990 is very interesting. One can say it is a kind of a cyclical development. We can distinguish among three periods of this development. Interestingly enough, the beginning and end of these periods coincide more or less the end and beginning of decades. So we can talk about the first decade of transition, whereby Hungary had a very positive pioneer role to play, not only compared to its own problems, but in the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, it had very positive and sometimes strikingly advantageous initial conditions. It was not a neo-Stalinist dictatorship. It was much more pluralistic than many other countries, including the neighboring ones, Czechoslovakia, Romania. And of course, it was also culturally and politically more liberal and open to Western influences. This was very important in the sense that the country was able to implement many of the important structural reforms at the very early days of transition. The first government already undertook a very serious, comprehensive, fundamental restructuring of the state-owned enterprises, allowed a huge amount of foreign investment to arrive, and also supported tremendously the organic development of small and medium-sized enterprises. All three contributed to what we can say supply-side adjustment. And that's important because in many countries the GDP loss was tremendous. Like in Russia, half of GDP was lost in the first decade. In the Ukraine, as it is an important example today to discuss, 60% of GDP was lost. In Hungary, it was less than 20%. So it was a comparatively mild transitional crisis. Growth was resumed very quickly right after the so-called austerity measures, which come with my name, Bokros package, because the country was on the verge of fiscal collapse by 1995. Everybody knows that. But we managed to avoid that, and we never had the problems of the Russian state and many other states, whereby the only way to equilibrate the budget was not to pay pensions and not to pay wages. We were able to avoid that, and we were also able to put the country on a road of sustainable export-led, investment-fueled growth without jeopardizing any more fiscal equilibrium. But I'm not talking only about the market economy. Market-oriented reforms are, of course, important, but democracy and the building of institutions of rule of law and those political institutions which lead to a competitive, democratic, liberal policy and political environment were equally important. So one can say that both the economic reforms and the political reforms went very much hand in hand, and they were having a mutually reinforcing positive impact. And Hungary was really, by the end of the first decade of transition, celebrated as a kind of a very positive pioneer example, especially in light of the 1998 Russian crisis, where many countries were already in terms of regression. And then came the second decade between 2001 and 2010. In that decade, there was no any new market-oriented reform implemented in Hungary anymore. That's important because obviously transition is a long process. I wrote an probably important book on that, and I keep saying that transition is a kind of a never-ending process, and it is still very much on the agenda. So it was very sad that transition stopped at the gates of what we call the public sector and did not penetrate into areas like healthcare, education, public administration, taxation. We always had a very large state in Hungary in terms of how much of GDP is being redistributed by the fiscal sector. It's close to 50%. It was very constantly kept at that level. I pushed back, then several governments after me pushed it further up. So in that respect, reforms are still very much in demand. In terms of the democratic institutions, political institutions, one thing is important. At least there was no attempt for any reversal. So the second decade was a kind of a stagnation in terms of reforms. No more market reforms, but no reversal. That's important. And then came the third decade, which is from 2010, when Viktor Orbán, the present Prime Minister of Hungary, came to power with a two-thirds majority. And that he regarded as an authorization for reversing course, both in the economy, but also in the political life. In the economy, one can see that very clearly by now. After a little bit more than 4 years of Fidesz government, the Hungarian GDP per capita is lower than it was in 2005. So there was no growth whatsoever in the last 10 years or so. There was a little bit of growth, but then decline, sharp decline. Hungary was the first to ask for IMF bailout in 2008, just 1 month after Lehman Brothers went under. That shows the fragility of and the precariousness and the weakness of the Hungarian economic situation, even in the second decade. So if one can go almost bankrupt 1 month after a triggering moment in the United States, that tells you a lot about the exposure and the vulnerability of your economy, which is, of course, after EU accession became fully open and fully liberalized. But more important, the regression and decline in terms of democratic institutions. Fidesz introduced a new constitution, which they call a basic law. The name is not important because we have Grundgesetz in other countries as well. But the content is a problem because it basically destroyed all checks and balances which we had in a multi-party democracy. Moreover, it had a negative spillover impact back onto the economy. For example, they nationalized the private pension system. They destroyed private property in name of protecting pensions, in name of paying back a very high level of public sector debt, which did not happen. They could not protect any of the pensions. Now there is an even bigger, huge gap in the so-called pay-as-you-go, state-managed, state-orchestrated, unfunded pension system. And at the same time, the public debt level is 84% of GDP right now, so it is higher. Basically, the whole amount of money which was invested into these private funds was wasted on prestige projects and on gross mismanagement and negligence. These checks and balances were destroyed in order to allow the state to extend its influence even on the private sphere of life. It means, for example, that the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court was emptied out completely. Today, the Hungarian Constitutional Court cannot even refer back to its own previous decisions as a precedent of law, because that was also written back into the Constitution by way of 5 amendments in 2 years to the new basic law. So there's an absolutely, there's no absolute guarantee or stability in terms of constitutional development in Hungary. Now, it's important because when you have progress in both areas, market and democracy, and then stagnation, and then regress, then the question is, of course, why it happens in a country which thinks of itself as a truly westernized country having a proud 1,000 years of history within Western civilization. I think it's important to mention a few important facts. One is that there's no denial of the impact of the international events. So Hungary is a small country and it cannot, should not, of course, isolate itself from international events. One is the weakening of the European Union, the pull of the European Union, and you have spoken about it very eloquently. I am now a member of the European Parliament. I have been a member for the last 5 years, and I realized that very clearly. Although, on the one hand, the European Parliament has gained influence in terms of becoming a co-legislator together with the European Council, it is now much more fragmented than it used to be before. And while 5 years ago, it could have been impossible for the extreme left and extreme right to unite in praising Russia, today this is exactly what is happening. They are considering the Western civilization in full terminal decline, and they praise the authoritarian, autocratic tendencies of Russia, Kazakhstan, China, a little bit of Turkey also, depending on, of course,
we're copying you.
Yeah, we're copying you. So it's an interesting situation. The other thing which we have to mention very clearly, some internal factors. Hungary wanted to become a fully westernized country in terms of offering the same high-level services and standards very quickly to the consumer, and as a consequence of that, foreign ownership has an extremely large share in many industries in Hungary. And now when the crisis came, the governments, populist governments, were able to blame the depth of the crisis to the foreigners and say that it is because we cannot control our own destiny. The present ruling party is not only a nationalist bunch, but it's also an etatist, if you will, a socialist or neo-communist bunch, as I call them from my perspective. Because they don't like the market, they don't like foreigners, they don't like competition, they don't like anything which comes from the outside and they cannot control. They like state ownership. So not only that they like state regulation, they like and they say what we want is more state ownership, not just Hungarian private ownership in banking, in public utilities, in telecom, in many other areas, but outright state ownership, as if it was the state which created growth, jobs, and investments. As a consequence, it is important to mention that now people look at Orbán and the whole administration as the saviors of the country. And Orbán is, of course, it's a short-term phenomenon. It will fly away, but it's important at this point in time. Has to go out desperately to find sources of finance to maintain this myth and mirage, which is kept at least has been kept until the election which happened in early April. Now he is the best friend of Russia. 25 years ago, he was the one who demanded the ousting of Soviet troops from the sacred soil of Hungary. Now he is the best friend and best disciple of Putin, and raised a 10 billion euro loan without any international tender to finance the reconstruction of the nuclear power plant in Poksh. Now, the last point I want to make, of course, there were huge policy mistakes made by previous administrations. Nothing comes out of the blue. There are precedents, there are historical antecedents, there are reasons and root causes for things like that. Maybe three important factors I can mention. One is that the governments, the socialist governments before Orban came to power in 2010 were extremely corrupt. Corruption has a very corrosive effect in the social fabric and political institutional setup of these countries. And the problem why the left could not project a credible alternative this time around in the elections in April was basically that the same people wanted to regain power as they were tarnished by their reputation before. So 40% of the people did not vote. That's important to know because I read it somewhere that the renewal of the two-thirds majority in Hungary is backed by 45% of the voters. No, it is only 27%. But many people did not vote. 40% were absent from the polls. We did not participate. My new party did not participate because the rules were so much distorted and the whole system was made so corrupt that it was, from the viewpoint of political honesty and morality, impossible to run. Another mistake, which was done by the previous governments, for example, allowing a huge number of people to raise foreign exchange denominated mortgage loans without an appropriate and adequate management of the exchange rate risk within that. And now you have 500,000 people underwater in the American term, so that they cannot and they probably should not repay their debt because the value of their asset is lower than the debt they have accumulated. And of course, there is an endless discussion who should share not only the blame, but even the loss and the burden. And this is a fertile ground for a populist nationalist government to share the blame with everybody but itself. And the last point, which I want to mention, is the new international setup, Ukraine, Russia, and in some other countries, Serbia, Romania to a certain extent, even Slovakia, not to speak of other countries, where there is a mutual reinforcement among extremist forces. I want to touch upon this because Fidesz tries to depict itself as if it was the main bulwark against Nazism. It is not. Fidesz and Jobbik, the extreme right Hungarian nationalist, racist, fascist party, is in cultural coalition with the present government, with Jobbik. It's important for us to remember. If we don't understand that, then it would be impossible to break up this very, very strange coalition and restart strengthening the factors and people and the hearts and minds of those who still cherish democracy. Thank you.